Hey, it's Jake, and today I'm going to walk you through how I made my logo animation. Take you step by step through the entire process, break it all down so that by the end of the video, you'll know exactly how I made it. I think one reason why a lot of people like my logo animation is because they think it's a lot more complicated than it actually is. And that's just because I layered a bunch of emotions on top of each other and a bunch of different colors so that it does look more complicated than it is. So I'm going to walk you through every step of this process, how I created it, and how I think you should approach something similar if that's what you want to do. So the first step of this whole process was just making my logo into paths that I could then use the trim paths shape layer operator on to reveal the logo. So let's take a look at the first step of this process. These are just the paths that I drew in Illustrator, brought them into After Effects, and then added trim paths on top of. Now the ending of that logo does look a little weird. The text that says Jake in Motion gets smaller and then thicker. That'll make more sense in a little bit. But what I want you to see in this first step is it's just trim paths. There's nothing complicated to that. If you've used trim paths before, then you know how this is done. I just have three separate paths making up three different sections of my logo. If you look at the logo as a whole, there's one for the hair, two for the face, and then I have this one little shape right here for another strand of hair. And then the eyes are not trim paths animations, they're just simple shape layers, and I just kind of scaled them up. So nothing complicated there. Same thing for the wink. It just scales down slightly and goes back to normal. But as a starting point, that's all there is to my logo animation. Trim paths coming in. Now it is a little bit more complicated because I have these paths going off the screen. With that selected, you can see the entire path. It goes off the screen. So what I did was just took my logo in its final form right here, and then I just drew paths, made a couple of loop-de-loops, and then just went off the screen so that I could animate it in from off screen. And then I just animated the trim paths value so that it ends where it's supposed to be, right here, so that at this point of the animation, we see the logo as I designed it. And the same thing goes for the other two strands. We've got this one that goes off to the right, this one that goes off to the bottom. I just extended the shapes out from where they already were. But for this red line right here, that wasn't enough because I didn't want it to animate off in the same way that it came on. I actually wanted it to transition into the letter J. If you look at this really closely, you can see that this line right here, that's kind of like the eyebrow, animates up and around, does another little loop, and then ends up being the J of the Jake in Motion. So I did the same thing there. I just added some paths to extend that shape out, do another cool little move with this little loop, and then end up in that J position using the trim paths to have it end in the exact spot that I needed it to. And I believe the other two lines just animate off the way that they came in. Yep, it looks like that's what I did. So they just go back off in the same direction that they came, and I just have the start and end values of the trim paths ending up in the same space so that it just disappears instead of moving all the way off screen. Now, at the same time all of that is happening, the text Jake in Motion is coming on. But again, it's nothing complicated. If I solo this pre-comp, it's just a bunch of straight lines coming in. And I did that on purpose. Anything that was a straight line, I just had come in at the same angle that it was already going to end up being. So this K right here, for instance, that comes in at the same direction that it ends up as in the final form of the logo. The only two shapes that didn't come in a straight line were the O's. Those just animate on in a circle. After I keyframed all those properties, I just staggered all of the motion. Now I should mention that I was using a preset that I actually created for School of Motion called Super Stroker, and I'll link to it in a card above so that you can check out the feature video of why I made that and how it works. But you don't need that to do this animation at all. It did make it a little bit easier. I think I even modified it a bit specifically for my logo. But for the case of this tutorial, I'm not going to even cover it because you really don't need it. It's just a workflow enhancement basically. So go check that out if you're interested, but trim paths on its own will get this job done. If you see Super Stroker on any of these, like the hair right here, if I press E to bring up the effects, there's Super Stroker and a bunch of other effects. That's how I originally drove this animation, but the fundamental backbone behind Super Stroker is the trim paths operator. So don't get confused by that if you see Super Stroker. But now that we understand how step one was done, let's go to step two. And this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. So I'm gonna give myself a little more room here so we can see all the layers, and I'll just play this back. Okay, so pretty similar, but there's a little bit of movement to the paths now. And the way that I got these paths to move is by using a script that ships with After Effects. If you go up to Window and then down to the Scripts section, there's one called Create Nulls from Paths. And what this allows you to do is generate null objects that drive paths on a shape layer. So what I'm gonna do is just dock this really quickly so I can show you exactly how this works. I'm just gonna make a new composition real quick and just draw a path. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but just something like this, okay? And then I'll go into the contents of my layer, select that path, and make sure that I'm actually on the path. And then I wanna create nulls from these paths. So if I say points follow nulls, I'll just click that. After Effects generated 3 null objects for me that are in the exact same spot as the points on my shape layer. And if I grab any one of these, it's going to move that path around. Exactly the same way as if I was just manipulating the paths. The benefit of this is that I can now have separate layer controls for each one of those points instead of just one keyframed property to drive everything in it. So if I just undo back to before I added those points and say I wanted to keyframe the path of this property, I'm going to set a keyframe there on the path, go forward just a little bit, and then manipulate this point here and this point here, maybe rotate it, move this one here. Then it's just going to linearly animate between those 2 points. I can't control the motion path of any of these points, and they're all moving at the exact same time. Let's say that I wanted this point to come back down at this point. I do that, it adds another keyframe, but they're still all happening at the exact same time. I don't really have any real control over how this motion is happening. But if I get rid of those keyframes and again say points follow nulls, now I could add individual position keyframes on each one of these nulls, maybe move that forward a second and then say push this one down, move this one up and over, and I'm getting motion paths for each of these. So I could switch back to my pen tool, curve out this motion path so it moves completely differently, and I could make this one go a little bit slower and have complete control over each one of these points' motion paths. If I play that back, now I have something that's completely different. So that's the added benefit of using this script, and that's how I drove the animation behind this second step of the process, where you can see these paths are not only being animated in using trim paths, but just watch the red line as it comes in, the paths are also moving. And I did that just to give it a little bit more life and make it look just slightly more interesting. And with this blue path right here, it happens even a little bit more strongly than that red line. If we take a look nice and close, you can see that the individual loops are kind of shrinking and moving in to kind of fold into place so it's not so static. Otherwise, this is identical to step 1. It just added a little bit of movement. And on this path right here that ends up being the smile, if I grab that path, I want to point out that these nulls can actually be parented to each other as well, and that's what I did in this process to animate them. So let me solo that, and I have layers shied because there are a lot of points in all of these paths, and it generates a null for every single one of them. So if I unshy my layers and just maximize this for a second, you can see there are tons and tons of nulls, and I color-coded them so that I could easily select all of them at once just by clicking the label color and saying select label group. Now I actually want the face blue path up here, so I'll select that label group, enable it, and solo it. And these are the nulls that are driving the animation for this particular path. And I'll show you what I mean by parenting these nulls together. If we take a look at the animation as it plays through, you can see that all the nulls are moving, and it seems a little bit complex, but it's just because I've parented every null to the null before it. So there's a parenting chain all along the path animation. So this one down here is the very first point in my path. And if I go up one layer at a time, you can just see the progression of that path throughout the entire thing. And basically each one of these has a rotation keyframe set. So what I did was I went to the final form of the animation after trim paths had happened, and I set a rotation keyframe at 0, at that neutral rotation, and then I just basically cranked it back a little bit all the way down the line. So this null right here is parented to the first null. and the null after it is parented to it. And all the way down the line, I just parented the next point in the path to the previous one. So if I rotate this first one, it's going to rotate everything because it's the master parent. If I go to the second one, which has some keyframes on it already, I could rotate it forward or backward as well, which doesn't have too much of an effect at this point because I had the rotation happening as the line was being animated on. I didn't want it to be all crazy and spaghetti-like. I just wanted to have some subtle movement so that you could see this wasn't a static path. But combining this all the way down the parent chain and staggering the motion kind of made it look like this line was just gradually moving into place as it got to that final state. And I did that with each of these paths. The same concept through each one. They were all just parented in a chain and then slightly rotated. It doesn't take a lot of rotation to get a lot of movement. So I tried to be as subtle as possible. And honestly, it doesn't look all that good in this state. I mean, it's fine, but I wasn't happy with it. I knew that I needed more. And that's when I moved to step 3, which is where I added a little bit of camera movement. It's not really camera movement, it's fake. But basically, if we play this back, you can see that now the logo is not only animating in, the paths have some movement to them, but the entire scene is rotating like a camera is flying through. It's rotating into place, it's scaling in and out, and that gives a lot of life to the entire animation. And I did this very simply just by using a null object, which I labeled scene control. And if I press U to bring up the keyframes, we can see that there's just scale and rotation keyframes. Since these are shape layers, I was able to crank this up to 300% scale without any loss in quality because they're being continuously rasterized. You'll always see nice, crisp, clean pixels that way. And it just scales down while rotating to that final state, but then it rotates in the opposite direction, scales up a little bit to kind of give this breathing motion, and then scales back down. Now this is where that text that we saw in step 1 and 2, the lines got thin here and then thick there. You can see how it kind of just changes scale. That was happening because of an expression that I was using to maintain your stroke width regardless of scale. So because the entire scene is scaling in, I didn't want those lines to get thicker. I wanted them to stay the same thickness. And I did that with an expression written by a guy named Adam Pluff, who actually runs Battle Axe, that made Rubber Hose and Overlord and a lot of other tools that are just essential to my workflow. But if I go to the stroke width property of any of these shape layers, there are a lot of expressions that are part of Superstroker. But right here, the stroke itself has an expression that I just copied and pasted. And this is actually an outdated version of it. There's an even more updated version that works in a lot more scenarios. But basically, it's taking the scale of that null object, the scene control that's scaling everything up and down, and then it's factoring in the stroke width that we have it set to maintain that size regardless of the scale of that null or the scale of that layer. And I applied that to every single stroke width on all of my shape layers, including this pre-comp where the text comes on in its own comp. I just had to reference the other comp so that it knew to look at the null object in the other comp. So that's how that's built. So let's take a look at this step 3 one more time. Now the trim paths is happening, the create nulls from paths is driving the motion of those paths, and then we have a little bit of scaling in, rotating, so that camera movement adds even more visual interest. Finally, we have step 4, and this is where things look a whole lot more complicated because I have multiple trim paths, multiple strokes happening, all overlapping and giving a lot more visual interest. And this was the final step of the process, getting it all to work. Like I said, I used my Superstroker preset that I wrote to drive this entire animation, but I'm gonna show you right now how you can do it without Superstroker using the exact same concept. So I'm again going to just make a new composition, and we'll just leave it 1920 by 1080 at 24 frames per second. And we're just gonna draw another path. So again, I'll just kind of do like a loop. And what I wanna do is just make a white stroke. Then I'll just add a solid in the background, and we'll fill that with a color, maybe one of the colors from my own color palette. We'll grab this one right here, and then move that to the back and lock it. And that's super hard to see, so let me just bring those colors out one more time, and I'm going to make that, for starters, this blue color. And I want my caps and my joins to be rounded, so I'm going to change that to round cap, round join. All right, there's my path. I need to add a trim paths to it. So let's go into the shape layer and add a trim paths. Okay, the contents of my layer are just a shape group with a stroke. I don't need the fill. There's the path. And then the trim paths is what's going to drive this part of the animation. Okay, so I'm going to add an end keyframe there, bring it back down to 0, put a starting keyframe at 0, and then 100%. And just move these ones forward. So what we have is this shape animating on and then animating back off. Okay, so that's the basics of trim paths if you didn't know it. But now that I have these keyframes animating on and off, I want to ease them. I did not realize how long this comp was, so I'm gonna make this much shorter really quickly. And just bring this nice and tight, zoom in so that we're just dealing with a couple of seconds. And now our line animates on and then animates off. Okay, we can go even faster than that. Just tighten this up one more time and then preview that. Okay, so our line comes on and our line comes off. But this is still a little bit boring, so I'm gonna ease all these keyframes with the F9 key on the keyboard and go into my graph editor and then just make this a little bit more extreme. So I'm gonna pull these handles out and now it's gonna animate much quicker. All right, now I'm gonna grab the second keyframes of both the start and the end and pull them forward, so now they're overlapping. And now it starts animating off before it's completely on. And I can even exaggerate that a little bit more if I just extend those keyframes out a bit more. And then maybe change the influence of these handles a little bit so that my shape is a little bit more like this with a gap in the middle. And now I have something that's just a little bit more interesting. Obviously, this is just an example. There's nothing crazy complicated about this. But I'm gonna change the stroke width maybe to say 20 pixels, just so we have this nice thin line. Okay, now the next step of the process was to give the path a little bit more motion with those nulls. So let's grab that shape layer, and go into that path, and then go up to our scripts again and grab create nulls from paths and say points follow nulls. Okay, can close that panel up, and now I have a null for each one of my points. So I'm just gonna quickly rename these to be point 1, point 2, point 3, and point 4. And I'm gonna do that parent chain again really quickly. I'm just gonna parent 4 to 3, 3 to 2, and 2 to 1. So now if I grab point 1 and rotate it, it rotates everything. And we do get a little bit of weirdness here because this isn't actually rotating the Bezier handles on the path, but we're not gonna be messing with that too much anyway, so it's not a big deal. But if I go to point 2, that's gonna rotate everything after it, and point 3 will just rotate the last point. All right, now that we have that, let's actually add some rotation keyframes. Point 1 is going to move everything. Point 4 will not move anything because it's the very end. So we just need rotation on 1, 2, and 3. And then I'll move those forward a little bit in time and then maybe just rotate these back slightly. It doesn't have to be a whole lot. I could even just grab maybe point 2 and rotate in the opposite direction. And point 1 could even be in the opposite direction. So we've got different rotations of different directions to make a shape that's completely different than the final, which is right here. I actually don't really like that movement. I think that I want this point to be curled in more like this. So I'm gonna just rotate that. And the other thing about this is you don't only have to do rotation. I could grab this point if I don't like where it is and also add a position keyframe. So I'll press Alt-Shift-P or Option-P on a Mac to set a position keyframe and move it forward. And then I could say bring it down a little bit. So now we have even more control over the shape of this motion. All right, with all of those keyframes set, I'm going to ease them all with F9, go into my graph editor, and I'm looking at the value graph right now. And I'm just going to ease all of them out. Now this is a little hard to see, so I'm going to maximize it really quickly. And I'm actually going to separate the dimensions of the position property for that point 4 so I can use the value graph and actually ease those again. But then I'll select all of those keyframes all at once and then just bring the influence out here while holding shift, bring the influence in a little bit here. And now we need to work on the timing of those keyframes. So I don't want them all happening at once. And I don't want them happening at that point in time. The line starts animating on right here, so that's basically where I want this first set of keyframes to start happening. I want some movement as that line is coming out. And then at this point, that's where it's hitting the next point in my null parent chain, so I can grab those keyframes and bring that back because we're gonna start seeing the influence of it right around this point. I don't want these keyframes happening before we can see the results of what they're actually affecting. So I'm just starting them about where the line is on that trim paths. So I'll continue down the line and that right there is the third point. So I'm gonna grab those two keyframes and drag it back a little bit, maybe not quite so far back. And then finally, we have these last two keyframes, which are controlling the position of that last point. I basically want those to be in sync with the rotation of the previous null so that it all kind of resolves at the same time. So now if I play that back, we get that motion, and it is a little bit drastic. This is where you can spend a lot of time tweaking keyframes and the timing of things to see how it affects the overall motion. Maybe everything is happening a little bit too quickly. Just spreading out those keyframes gives it a different vibe. And you can also play around with the easing of the trim paths. Maybe everything is happening a little too extremely in here, and I could ease off of those influence handles so they're not quite as quick. Now, I'm not going to pretend like I knew exactly what I wanted my logo to look like on the first try. It was something that I had to tweak and go back and forth with and play with the timing and see what worked for what I had in my head. Once I was happy with the motion, then I moved on to duplicating that stroke and having it go on to multiple colors. So let's take a look at how I would do that. Since it's all controlled by nulls and driven by expressions, I can now duplicate this shape layer. So let's call this line 1, and then duplicate it so we have line 2. So now I have a second copy of this line that's being driven by the exact same keyframes. And if I bring up my color palette and change the color to being this yellow color, so let's grab that, change it to say yellow, or actually maybe even red. We'll just go straight with the red color. Now I have those two paths directly on top of each other. What I want to manipulate now is the trim paths keyframes for that red shape layer so that they're happening just behind the blue line. So the blue line is going to be the one that leads the path, but then the red shape comes on top of it. So with that line 2 selected, I'll press U to bring up those keyframes, and then just select all of them and shift them over one frame in time by pressing Alt or Option on a Mac and the right arrow key. And just like that, I now have a blue leader that's quickly followed up by that red line. And I could do this again if I duplicate the line, maybe change the color to the yellow color, and then offset those keyframes forward one more frame. And now I have 3 lines that make it look a lot more complicated than it actually is. Now, I actually think that the colors should be reversed, so I'm going to quickly just reverse my layers. So line 1 is on top, line 2 is in the middle, line 3 is on the bottom, and then I need to reverse the staggering of these keyframes. So I'll back these ones up to the start of the layer. These ones are staying right where they are, and then this set of keyframes will move 2 frames forward, so that now we have the yellow leader followed by the red and ending up with the blue. Now, what you'll notice is that when it animates off, we're not seeing those other lines, and that's because the blue set of keyframes was all set symmetrically. So the animating off should actually be happening 2 frames sooner than the first layer rather than 2 frames after it. So I need to back this up 2 frames. This is just the start property here. Again, the second line can stay where it is because I only have 3 shapes. And then I move the starting value of the last layer 2 frames forward. So now it overlaps in the same way. It starts with the yellow and it ends with the yellow. And that red line is right in between the whole time. All right, so there is an issue. If we pause, say right about there, and zoom in, especially on the edges of this blue, you can see that there are just some unwanted pixels and colors showing up because all of these shape layers are exactly the same width. So the edges of those pixels that are getting anti-aliased, they have very semi-transparent pixels to soften it. If I turned off the anti-aliasing, which you can do on any layer by the way, if I select these, click on this switch right here, now there's no anti-aliasing, everything is 100% transparent or 100% opaque, and it's jagged, it does not look good. That is why you want anti-aliasing. It's just that you have the side effect of semi-transparent pixels, so being able to see 2 shapes that should be exactly the same size, they are the same size, can blend together with those edges. So what I need to do to fix that is grab lines 2 and 3 and just back the stroke off ever so slightly. I don't need to go, super far like this, but maybe just a half a pixel even. 19.3 is a little more than half a pixel, and that gets rid of those stray pixels that we're seeing on the outside edges. And at 100% resolution, you can't really even tell that you've taken away any width from that stroke. So now that that's done, I have my line animating on. The same nulls are driving the shape of each one of those paths, and then I offset the stroke. Now, I can take this even a step further because currently it's all just animated one frame apart from each other, but I want to say tighten up the way that these three colors are meeting at the end so that they end much closer together. And to do that, I can just, again, bring up those keyframes, and I'll grab the end value for each one of the trim paths, make sure I don't move them around, and I just want to tighten them up. Now, they are already pretty tight. They're just one frame apart, but to make this more dramatic, I'm going to actually spread everything out by 3 frames real quick. So I'm just going to grab these keyframes up here, which are offset by 1 frame each, and shift them forward 2 frames, deselect this layer, and go 2 more frames forward. So now everything has more space between them, and we have bigger segments between each color. Now, like I said, I want these lines to be closer to each other as they end. So I'm going to grab the end value, the second keyframe of each end value, and with each one of those selected, instead of having them 1, 2, 3 frames apart each, I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key and grab the first or last keyframe, and then just click and drag inwards, and that's going to compress proportionally the distance between each one of those keyframes. So I can just back that up to where they're not even a whole frame apart. You see this keyframe right here is halfway between a frame. So these lines are coming together much more quickly at the end, or a lot more close together. And it's a pretty subtle thing, but it again adds to the visual interest of the animation rather than just having them each segmented at that whole 1 frame apart that we had before. And you can even take this a little bit further if you go into your graph editor, and then under this menu right here, you can say allow keyframes between frames. And what this allows you to do is grab these keyframes and shift them around freely between frames. They don't have to be on any single frame. If I just grab one of these and move it around, you see that it's not snapping. I'm holding shift to snap it horizontally, but I can go, if I zoom in nice and close, between any one of these frames at any point. It's completely unconstrained and gives you a lot more precise control over the placement of those keyframes. So if I wanted to say grab the start value of each one of these trim paths and bring these ones even closer together, they're all 1 frame apart, I can now do that with even more fine-tuned control than using that proportional spaced method that I was using with the Alt key in the regular timeline. But now that it's moved within that graph editor, they show up in the exact same place in the timeline. Moving them around is going to snap them to whole frames here because there's no option to move keyframes between frames in the standard view, but going into that graph editor allows you to modify that however you want. But that's really the core concept behind how I animated those keyframes. And now that those are offset, it's all messed up. It's not showing the layers below it anymore, so I'd want to reverse this so it's more like that. But again, I can bring that closer together so that those lines end up very compressed and just aligned to disappear much more closely. But that's the core concept behind how I animated my logo and how all of those paths and overlapping them and controlling them with the nulls all really worked to bring me to this end result of my final logo animation. So I hope that you got something out of the breakdown of my logo animation. It really, again, is not that complicated. It's just a lot of layering steps, a lot of tweaking animation curves so that we get really nice motion, and adding layers of motion to just create more visual interest than we would have had all the way back here at step 1 with just basic trim paths. So that's really all there is to it. If you use this technique at all, be sure to tag me on Instagram at JakeInMotion so I can see it and give you a like. And please share this video if you liked it. It really helps get my channel a little bit more attention, and I want to be able to just share as much of my knowledge with as many people as possible, so it really helps me get the word out. Obviously, if you like this type of content, be sure to comment, like, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you want to give back in a monetary way and help support the channel even more, check out my Patreon. Thank you so much to all the patrons over there. I'm incredibly grateful for all of the support that I receive over there, and I just want to again say thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.
And